listener production. Hi, Natarsha Belling with you. Welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Australia's fragile alliance with the United States is our top story today. It comes after Prime Minister Anthony Albanese slammed Donald Trump's move to enforce trade tariffs on our steel and aluminium. For our deep dive this afternoon, we are joined by former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who will share his insights into what this means for our future alliance in trade, but also, more importantly, security, as the world continues to grapple with growing uncertainty. Firstly, let's recap these key developments this Wednesday, the 12th of March. The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, has hit back at Donald Trump's decision to enforce Australian steel and aluminium with 25% tariffs. Mr Albanese warning true allies don't undermine each other's economies.
Such a decision by the Trump administration is entirely unjustified. This is against the spirit of our two nations' enduring friendship and fundamentally at odds with the benefits that our economic partnership has delivered over more than 70 years.
Meantime, Opposition Leader Peter Dutton has argued the coalition government would have locked in a tariff exemption from the Trump administration, saying the Prime Minister and Ambassador to the US, Kevin Rudd, have mishandled the relationship.
Because of the Prime Minister's inability to deal with this issue, Australian jobs are at risk and Australian industry is at risk. And the Prime Minister needed to get this right and he didn't.
And joining us now is former Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, who this week has been incredibly vocal about his concerns over President Trump and the future of our alliance with the United States. Mr Turnbull, thanks for joining us. First question to you is the Prime Minister held a special news conference this morning about this decision by Mr Trump with the tariffs to Australia. I'm paraphrasing the Prime Minister. He said this was entirely unjustified and fundamentally at odds with the economic partnership we in the US have shared for more than 70 years. What are your thoughts on that response?
Well, I think it's the right response. I mean, it is utterly unjustified. The Americans have got the best possible trade deal they could have with Australia. They have no tariffs on exporting stuff here. They've got no barriers to investment, and they've got a whacking trade surplus. That these are the points, that I made in 2018 and was successful in getting the exemption then. But, as I've said before, this time they have decided, and they decided some time ago, they were going to have no exemptions at all. So, it's not Albanese's fault that they didn't get an exemption. They didn't give one to anybody. But it's still, his criticism is still absolutely valid. I mean, look, it's quite counterproductive for America to do this, and it's only going to increase costs within the United States.
On that point, Mr Turnbull, the current opposition leader, Peter Dutton, has come out this afternoon saying these tariffs and being enforced on Australia is the result of mismanagement from both the current Prime Minister and also Kevin Rudd, who is the ambassador. Would you agree with Mr Dutton's thoughts on that?
No, I really wouldn't. Look, Peter's the opposition leader and he's got to say those things. I've had that job. I know what it's like. So you've got to cut him a bit of slack there. But no, the reality is they had made up their mind. Obviously, Albanese and Rudd and Wong and everybody else have done their best to, get a special exemption for Australia, but I don't think it was ever realistically available. You see, the protectionist people in the Trump administration, including Mr Trump, but people like Peter Navarro, for example, have said that the decision to give exemptions to some countries in 2018 was a mistake because once they gave an exemption to us, for example, then another friendly nation comes along and says, well, why don't we get one? We're just as good as the Aussies. And suddenly you discover that you're not actually raising much money in tariff revenue at all. So I think that and the other point too, Natasha, is that you've got to ask, what are the Americans trying to achieve? They are trying to build up their own industries at the expense of everybody else. So what do they say? They say, America first. If you don't want to pay the tariffs, move your factory into America, build your plants in America. Trump says that every day. I mean, he even says to the Canadians, if you don't want to pay our tariffs, become part of the United States. I mean, he's trying to, use economic pressure to get the Canadians to basically give up their country. So this is a ruthlessly America first policy. So that means, in a way, from Trump's point of view, it doesn't matter whether he's got a good trade deal with Australia or not in the light of that, because he just wants to advantage the American steel sector and the American aluminium sector at the expense of everybody else. And so, as Albanese said, that is not a friendly act, and it's not.
In regards to the trade scenario, that's front and centre. It's America first. There's been a lot of analysis now about what this means with our alliance regarding security. We know America is our most powerful ally. We know right now in the world there is great instability, including with Russia and Ukraine. What does this mean for our security alliance with defence? What does this mean moving forward for us?
Well, look, this is just a part of it. In isolation, it may not mean a great deal. I mean, we've had an alliance with the Americans ever since the 1950s, and there have been periods when there have been high tariffs on both sides of the Pacific. But the real problem is that Donald Trump has demonstrated that we cannot assume that the Americans will come to our aid. I mean, look at the way he's treated the Europeans. The NATO treaty is a much tougher, tighter treaty than the ANZUS treaty. The Europeans feel they have been abandoned. Look at the way he's effectively switched sides in the war between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, when he was just, trying to get a peace deal, he didn't use his strength to force Russia to the table. No, he punched down on the weaker party, Ukraine, and, when they weren't sufficiently compliant, stopped intelligence sharing and shut down military aid until they were compliant. So this is a very, very different America to the one we have grown up with. And what does it mean for Australia? It means that we can no longer assume that in times of peril the United States will come to our aid, and we have to focus on our own sovereignty and our own security. I'm having a conference in Canberra at the end of the month to discuss that. I think this is the big issue that not enough people, and particularly not enough people in government and in Canberra, are talking about. Because this, Chris Barry, the former Chief of the Defence Force, Admiral Barry, said the other day that this Trump 2, Mark II, is the biggest wake-up call Australia has had since the fall of Singapore. Think about that.
So if World War III erupts, which is a possibility considering what's going on in the world right now, we can't depend on America to be by our side? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I don't think we can assume it. No, I don't think we can. And what may be their price? Do we fancy doing a minerals deal? I mean, what if he wants half the iron ore royalties from Western Australia? I mean, who knows? This is a very highly transactional president, and he sees his job as using America's military and economic power to get the greatest advantage for America, hence America first.
One may argue, Mr Turnbull, that regarding the situation with Ukraine and Russia, that interesting press conference, which he was slammed about doing with Volodymyr Zelensky, today there are developments that apparently Ukraine has come to the table. The ball is firmly in Russia's court. If there is some peace deal achieved, one may argue that even if there were bully tactics, that Mr Trump was right doing what he did.
Well, if the peace is on Putin's terms, if the peace results in Ukraine being demilitarised, if the peace involves Ukraine giving up a quarter of its country, if the peace involves no security guarantees for Ukraine, so there's nothing to stop Putin coming back in a few years and gobbling up the rest, that's not much of a deal. I mean, this is the thing that is so wrong about Trump's approach on Ukraine, because you would think that if you are the superpower, America, you would be using your strength to get the Russians to the table. You'd be saying to Putin, look, I'll support a peace deal, but you've got to come to the table and you've got to be reasonable. We've got to ensure that Ukraine is protected. And if you don't come to the table, I will give them all the arms in the world and you'll never defeat them. Instead, what he's done is he's kneecapped Volodymyr Zelensky and put him in the position where he's basically, without doing whatever Trump wants, he's not able to continue the fight. I mean, it's real. I think it is really shameful.
In the two superpowers right now, people may argue it's Russia and China that we really need to be concerned about, considering what has happened with the situation with trying to reach a peace deal with Ukraine. Are you concerned that Mr Trump is continuing to side with Russia at all costs?
Well, of course I'm concerned that he's siding with Russia. I mean, Putin is a tyrant. He's invaded Ukraine. He's seized, around a quarter of its territory in a war that's resulted in the death of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians, not to speak of course, hundreds of thousands of people of his own side. And the way things look at the moment, he's going to be rewarded for that. I mean, look at Trump's language, Natasha, after the humiliation of Zelensky in the Oval Office and the cutting of military aid to Ukraine. Russia dramatically increased its missile attacks on Ukraine. Trump's comment on that, well, of course anybody would do that. I mean, he didn't say that's a terrible thing to do, that's shameful, that's wicked. No, Trump believes might is right. I mean, this is a really important point. I mean, we believe, and the US used to believe, in the international rules-based order and defending democracy around the world. Donald Trump has no interest in that. He's interested in power and he's interested in securing advantage for America. And this is not a criticism of Trump, for fear that someone from, News Corp is listening and, they want to write an editorial saying how dreadful I am for saying mean things about their favourite politician, Donald Trump. Donald Trump says this himself. This is literally on the tin, America first. And so, the big challenge for us is how do we as a middle-sized power, how do we defend ourselves and, advance our national interest in a might is right world where there is no major power that actually shares our values. America doesn't any longer. Russia certainly doesn't. China would say it does, by the way, but I think we're all very sceptical about that. So it's a tough environment. And the bottom line is we're going to have to spend more on defence, but we're going to have to spend it in a way that gives us the ability to defend ourselves without the Americans. And that's the challenge.
Mr Turnbull, there's been an article today about your thoughts about Mr Trump and being a bully and what we should do as a country. And in Crikey, there's two schools of thought. There's been an interesting debate on your opinions about Mr Trump, saying people are saying, agreeing with you, saying Mr Turnbull is right, we must stand up to Mr Trump at all costs. And then there's other people that say, respectfully so, Mr Turnbull, you should retreat to your comfortable mansion and quiet diplomacy is the way to go. What do you think we should do as the country right now?
Well, I mean, I'm not suggesting that our Prime Minister should be abusing Trump or being rude or anything like that, but you have to be able to stand up for your values. I don't expect the Australian Prime Minister to say Trump is a bully. He is a bully, of course, and, we're free to say that. But if you're the PM, you shouldn't be saying that. But what you need to be doing is making your case respectfully and strongly, both in public and in particular in private. And that's how I, persuaded Trump, despite his rage and fury, to stick with the refugee deal that I'd done with Obama. It's how I persuaded him to give us the steel and aluminium tariff exemptions in 2018. Look, I don't claim to know a lot about many things, but one thing I do know a lot about is the role of the Australian Prime Minister in dealing with Donald Trump. I've been there and done that. And so while I gratefully accept the considered views of people in the media who, this is one of the few topics I actually know what I'm talking about. Look, bottom line, he is a bully. He respects strength. If you're not strong, he won't respect you and he'll run over the top of you. And look, applies in global politics. It applies in the schoolyard.
Mr Turnbull, thanks for joining us this afternoon.
Thanks, Natasha.
And that was former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us so you don't miss our episodes or our deep dive of the day. You can also follow us on our socials, on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, and also on TikTok and YouTube. Just search Listener Newsroom. That is LISTNR. And we'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company. See you tomorrow.